Okay, welcome back to our sessions on educating present and future leaders to promote global peace. And before I go in and introduce our next speaker, I wanted to mention a couple of other organizations that are helping us to do this annual meeting. The Holy Apostles College and Seminary, of course, which I presumed all of you had been aware of, but I want to make other people aware of that. And the Catholic Distance Learning Network of the National Catholic Educational Association, and the King's College in Manhattan. That being said, the next speaker I want to introduce is Mariana Barillas. And Mariana is going to be talking on some critical thoughts about the scientific pedagogy of critical thinking. Mariana, I've known for quite a number of years. She was a student on our homeschool program for the Angelicum Academy, and also worked as a tech person for the Angelicum. Worked as a tech person in a couple of my classes for Holy Apostles College and Seminary. She's extremely talented, as you'll see from the presentation she's going to give. She's interned at a number of different organizations, including recently at the Heritage Foundation. She's been a journalist. I recall her telling me when she was going through the university out in Michigan that for a time that one of her professors had asked her whether she was a foreign student because he was very impressed by her knowledge of different things and couldn't believe she had been educated in America. So Mariana's also been a journalist. She was featured on the Drudge Report, one of her articles recently, and she's working as a reporter now for the Washington Examiner. So Mariana, come on up.
I'd like to thank Dr. Redpath for his very kind introduction. The title, if you'll note on the, the overall presentation is called Educating Present and Future Leaders, A View from the Trenches. So one of the great ironies of modern education is how often people use the term critical thinking uncritically, rarely stopping to reflect on what it means and why they hold it to be important. According to Ken Petras, in an article published in the journal Education, quote, critical thinking is a pervasive academic literature term that is seldom clearly or comprehensively defined. And unquote, end quote. Definitions that are available in various sources are quite disparate, unquote. This was definitely something I encountered as an undergraduate student. I only recently graduated. As many of my professors impressed upon me that their primary purpose is to develop critical thinking skills in their students. But the term was used more often than it was defined. Needless to say, I was confused and decided to do a little digging to better understand what my professors were trying to teach me. I was surprised to find it's a fairly new concept, derived from progressive education reformer John Dewey's 1910 book, How We Think, where he states his purpose is to help teachers understand and foster in their students reflective thought and, quote, attitude of mind, that habit of thought which we call scientific. While reflective thought didn't catch on to describe his teachings, another term he uses in the text, critical thinking, did, and became an academic buzzword and the basis of a revolution in American education. But it appears to be failing. Though our entire educational system seems to be focused on the single goal, I have heard academics complain countless times about their frustrating failure to get students to adequately engage and conceptualize classroom materials. Universities are entering into an existential crisis because they are not imparting the ill-defined critical thinking skills that are largely viewed as a core of their mission. Something all but confirmed in the 2011 book, Academically Adrift, where sociologist Richard Arum found that more than a third of thousands of students surveyed made no significant improvement in critical thinking skills after 4 years in college. Reflecting on Dewey's immense influence, his pragmatist colleague Hilda Neatby wrote that he was not just a philosopher, but the philosopher of our age, a conscious reference to the honorary title that medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas used for his intellectual forefather Aristotle. Perhaps what we need is a new philosophy of education. Having studied all three thinkers, I found what Dewey proposes is arbitrary and subjective, ironically undermining students' intellectual development and science as a whole by failing to offer a basis to justify judgments or a way of relating the different subjects of study. By comparison, Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas argue that fully developing a truly scientific habit of mind requires justifying our thinking processes with the first principles that have their origin in a divine science called metaphysics. My experience in higher education has led me to believe reform requires replacing the current critical thinking approach with the traditional metaphysics, since the study provides the intellectual framework to make everything, including our own thought processes, intelligible, allowing students' minds and spirits to flourish. First, we need to explore what Aquinas and Aristotle meant by a scientific habit of mind. They conceive science and philosophy as being essentially synonymous, the way in which we attempt to make judgments about the nature of the universe. Wisdom is achieved through knowledge of the four causes: formal, material, efficient, and final, by which we recognize a subject of study as it exists. This causal knowledge is obtained through a complex internal process involving our faculties, notably the senses, the intellect, the will, the emotions, and the imagination. All scientific activity begins in wonder, a first perception through our senses that inspires an emotional state of fear based on our ignorance of a cause. With the hope that we can end this emotional state, to initiate an inquiry, using our imagination to form concepts and images to help reveal the essence of the subject of study. Based on what the imagination is able to reveal about a thing's essence, the intellect is able to judge truth and falsity, completing the reasoning process. Essentially, as Aquinas writes in De Trinitate, we know something because we have dematerialized its existence, its causes, through our uniquely human power of abstraction. The scientific habit of mind is a full body experience, only fully complete when we are intellectually, emotionally, and volitionally satisfied, putting wonder to rest with an understanding of the causes of existence. Rather than a study of being, Dewey proposes science is primarily the study of motion, and the only causal knowledge that remains essential is interactions between objects whose internal natures are beyond our capacity to determine. Calling his vision instrumentalism because theories are judged by their value as useful instruments to explain and predict phenomena. The purpose of, quote, reflective thought is to strengthen unquote, is to strengthen the individual's capacity to will an ordering of their mind to understand these cause and effect relationships, to base their beliefs on the, quote, survey of available evidence, rather than unexamined assumptions or prejudices, which are the product of our social environment. Dewey states thinking is, quote, an operation in which present facts suggest other facts or truths in such a way as to induce belief in the latter upon the ground or warrant of the former. Each perceived fact builds on the other, and a, quote, stream or flow becomes a chain or thread, terminating in a final judgment. Thinking becomes an artificial construction of perceived truths or facts that form within each individual's mind. The problem is Dewey fails to propose a rationale by which we base an ordering of the facts, how they relate to one another to express a truth, or an adequate method of confirming the validity of our perceptions. Compared to the complex theory proposed by Aquinas and Aristotle, in which every aspect of the person is involved in arriving at truth, Dewey's simplistic logical ordering of perceived facts is woefully incomplete and superficial. But for proponents of critical thinking, its lack of a coherent epistemology, even an agreed upon definition of the term, may be a reflection of the belief that the disparate disciplines require a disparate ordering of facts. Dewey writes, quote, "No hard and fast rules for this operation of selecting and rejecting or fixing upon the facts can be given. It all comes back, as we say, to the good judgment, the good sense of the one judging. This power in ordinary matters we call knack, tact, cleverness. In more important affairs, insight, discernment." It is hard to imagine one of the former presidents of the American Philosophical Association being ignorant of the works of the ancient Greek philosophers, which makes the use of the term knack to describe his science striking. In the Gorgias dialogue, Socrates dismisses rhetoric as neither an art nor a science, but a, quote, knack, merely a, quote, guess at what's pleasant with no consideration for what's best, that can give, quote, no account of the nature of whatever things it applies by which it applies them, so that it's unable to state the cause of each thing. Similarly, Dewey claims causes of being have no place in science because their existence can neither be confirmed nor refuted by further observation or experience, i.e. empirically. While Dewey asserts that he is grounding human inquiry in demonstrable evidence, Aquinas and Aristotle would reject his theories as being at odds with science. Rather than certain knowledge, a guess, as there are no first principles by which to begin an inquiry, and causal knowledge is dismissed on the outset as unverified belief. Dewey argues these concepts are one of many socially constructed prejudices, quote, unseen and unconsidered causes, informed by, quote, past experience, received dogmas, and the stirring of self-interest, the arousing of passion, sheer mental laziness, a social environment steeped in biased traditions or animated by false expectations, and so on, unquote. But by proposing a method of controlling rather than escaping from these prejudices, Dewey's reflective thought cannot avoid falling into a paradox where the rational internal habit of mind is informed by irrational externalities. This problem is illustrated in the following passage from How We Think. He writes, quote, "Just what is suggested to a person in a given situation depends upon his native constitution, his originality, his genius, temperament, the prevalent direction of his interests, his early environment, the general tenor of his past experiences, his special training, the things that have recently occupied him continuously or vividly, and so on. To some extent, even upon an accidental conjunction of present circumstances. These matters, so far as they lie in the past or in external conditions, clearly escape regulation. A suggestion simply does or does not occur. This or that suggestion just happens, occurs, springs up. If, however, prior experience and training have developed an attitude of patience in a condition of doubt, a capacity for suspended judgment, and a liking for inquiry, indirect control of the course of suggestions is possible." So, unquote. So, at best, his view of the thinking process remains subjective and particularized, based primarily on individual experience, not universal principles, first principles of knowing. As truth is now understood as what each person perceives, education is reduced to a political process by which socially constructed prejudices are eliminated through critical thinking. This is not to say that there is not value in contradicting unexamined claims. But instead of a search for truth's sake, Dewey states education is a, quote, regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness, and that the adjustment of individual activity on the basis of this social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction. With tolerance of each other's subjective perceptions, the primary goal of the modern education system, students are now given an impossible task to reach conclusions about their world without a standard by which to judge the good, the true, and the beautiful. Underlying the folksy, unassuming language and seemingly prudential for the American educational system is not just a progressive political agenda, but a radical rejection of prior philosophic thinking. Dewey's empirical approach is designed to remediate what he described in his book, Knowledge and Experience, as a common tendency in the Western intellectual tradition, what he called the philosophic fallacy, which he describes as improperly universalizing the particular by generalizing conclusions from individual experiences into abstract first principles of knowledge. Dewey argues that application is essential to reflective inquiry, but we must guard against using a preconceived theory to justify our conclusions, rather than the conclusions justifying the theory. Valid generalizations, he states, can be easily identified because they tend to, quote, spontaneously apply themselves. But as the very mental processes that inform his vision of the scientific habit are arbitrary and particularized constructions, so is our science, and it is unclear how we can justify what we have learned in one discipline to another. Since modern students must develop a new critical thinking process to reflect the empirically derived facts of each subject of study, this fragmentation of the sciences has led them to struggle to form a coherent conception of human knowledge. Though I've spent most of my time critiquing Dewey's thinking, his egalitarian effort to guard science against the indiscriminate application of a theory useful in one discipline to explain every conceivable phenomena in all others is admirable. But the scientific habit proposed by Aquinas and Aristotle provides a better remedy for the sometimes exclusionary tendencies Dewey identifies of an elite academia whose theories often seem at odds with reality. Dewey is correct to say that metaphysics is the least apparent to our senses and cannot be verified empirically. But for Aristotle and Aquinas, it is the most certain of all the sciences, because it concerns universal principles so basic as to be self-evident. The universe must be ordered to be intelligible, our sense and intellectual faculties can reliably perceive reality, and our conclusions are a reflection of the unity of truth. These pre-metaphysical observations inform the realization of the first science, which gives metaphysics, which gives the inquirer a more complete understanding of precisely what they are doing and why. Though all the sciences borrow their principles from metaphysics, each discipline differs based on what is being studied, how it is being studied, and why it is being studied. What is being studied, how it is being studied, and why it is being studied. So the sciences are divided based on what human good they realize, hierarchically ordered based on the level of abstraction necessary to come to conclusions. That which is more immaterial is more intellectual, more scientific because it is less dependent on matter and motion to come to conclusions. Even the scientific habit itself differs in each discipline, as the intellect concludes its judgments in the human faculty that generates the necessary evidence to express the nature of that which is being studied. For example, As all the information necessary for the intellect to make judgments about mathematics is revealed in the imagination, the study terminates in that particular faculty, while metaphysics terminates its judgment in the human intellect alone, because considering the causes of being is beyond the conceptual capacity of any other faculty. For the scientists to truly fulfill their purpose, they must understand how their activities relate to the higher and lower sciences, and how they help to realize the overall objectives of philosophy, science as a whole. As each person has a capacity to generate human knowledge through their actions, the dignity of the practitioners of the disparate disciplines is elevated through common participation in the realization of the fullness of truth, a universality that might appeal to Dewey's egalitarian sensibilities. Incorporating difference while providing a unified whole, we ground our pursuit of the unknown in the certainty of that which we should know best. And as this vision of science considers the entirety of existence, whether it be material or immaterial, it allows for studying the transcendent. Dewey's vision of science is far less ambitious than that proposed by the ancients. It assumes the secrets of the universe cannot be unlocked by our all-powerful method before we even begin looking for the key. In replacing classical metaphysics with a narrow-minded empiricism that is skeptical of everything except its own materialist assumptions, Dewey may be guilty of the same overgeneralization he critiques. Students are struggling not because they're stupid or lazy, but because they are immersed in an academic culture that has little capacity to develop their natural abilities. Rather than racing in pursuit of knowledge, it often felt like myself and my fellow classmates were running in circles because we couldn't find the starting line. But after being introduced to Aristotelian Thomism by Dr. Redpath, I found it gave me the intellectual framework to analogously relate the sciences to one another and see the underlying principles that give them intelligibility, which made learning new subjects less daunting since they were never entirely new. To my surprise, the more I adhered to this approach, the more my other professors complimented my, quote, critical thinking skills. So by rejecting the idea that a person can conceptualize without recognizing the existence of self-evident first principles, they ironically believed I was confirming the wisdom of their postmodern educational model. This doesn't mean that every student should be required to take a metaphysics course, although I would recommend they do, particularly if they have a professor as wonderful as Dr. Redpath. But it does mean that each of our studies should be grounded in the self-evident truths found in the divine science. Intending to common citizens to judge for themselves through the creation of a science that reflects their experience in the world, rather than relying on those locked away in the gleaming ivory tower, Dewey clearly hoped to demythologize and democratize human knowledge. But without a specific method of conceptualization, the critical thinking approach offers little guidance to students. Educating present and future leaders, A View from the Trenches, is a fairly grim presentation title. But like a private in World War I found that despite my professors' best efforts to form their students, their adherence to an outmoded approach with political goals at odds with reality failed to help me navigate life's battlefield. We must restore a rationally justifiable scientific habit of the mind that allows us to consider that each question has an answer. And speaking of which, now that I've given you time to think critically about critical thinking, I am open to any questions you in the audience might have. Thank you.
Mariana's great adversity to the Angelical Academy History Program. Absolutely.
Message that when they praise your critical thinking skills, well, actually, this is based on Thomas Aquinas.
So actually, I wrote, funny story. So I actually wrote a paper that was kind of the genesis of this one for my English course. And it was essentially saying that whatever you guys were teaching, critical thinking, you're doing it wrong. And she gave me an A. despite her, and she actually gave me some very good comments, which I very much appreciated. So that was funny. I do think she was a little bit uncomfortable. So a little bit on the defensive in terms of her comments, which I don't blame her for.
Sneaky focus.
Yes, very sneaky comments.
Critical thinking seems to be what has replaced the study of logic on a wide scale. A logic course is a tough sell to an undergraduate. Critical thinking is an easier way to sell the idea of thinking clearly and logically. Do you have any thoughts on what's wrong with logic in universities today? For my part, I'm fond of the old Aristotelian syllogistic. Modern symbolic logic, critical logic is forbidden for anyone who is a philosophy major or a math major. Did you have any thoughts on the situation of logic in the university? I think the area of greatest concern is how, whether it's logic, ancient or modern, or whether it's critical thinking, it seems to be detached from the integration within the trivium. So critical thinking together with grammar and rhetoric. Do you have any thoughts on the place of the trivium in the university, how it's being neglected? Any thoughts on the approach to logic?
Well, actually, this is a little bit more in Dr. Gabbat's expertise, the trivium, historically, what's happening with that. But I think that modern university, I think it would probably consider logic courses, logic to be a species of critical thinking. I think it's, and this was actually our Reno, the editor of First Things, actually gave a talk about, we call it thinking critically about critical thinking, where he argues he just said, you go to a typical faculty meeting, and they all disagree about everything. And none of them can, and they've all got their different theories about, the universe that have no applications to reality, perhaps. But basically, they can all sit around the table and say, you're the logician, you're the Marxist, you're the biologist, but you know what gives our university unity is that we're all about developing students' critical thinking skills. That's how we can justify all of our disciplines.
I admire to a certain extent the logicians, especially at public universities, because they tend to be more under attack than anybody. It's kind of like the last line of defense against total anarchy, intellectual anarchy. But one of the things that I found interesting as a result of the Cartesian revolution, that goes back to Descartes, and I found this out accidentally in the early 1980s, because I had come down with something close to walking pneumonia, if not walking pneumonia, and I wasn't able to lecture to my students, which was one of the best things that I found, and also to the students. And so I had to figure out some way of engaging the students in pedagogy. And I found that I got Plato's dialogues, and I started having to read the dialogues in class and then converse about the dialogues, which is one of the reasons I also got interested in Irish approach to learning. Even though I had known about it before I had an interest in it, but it increased. One of the things that I found that setting a book in front of the students at the university, and This wouldn't have been the case in the 1960s where the students could read, but they just refused to do so. You know, in Brooklyn, for example, you don't do this, and anybody can read text and converse about it, but somebody really talented, you know, take a look at it and then go. That was the kind of attitude. But by the time the 60s had, by the time the 1980s had come around, putting a book in front of the students and asking them to read, they discovered they couldn't pronounce the words. It was actually astounding. That it was like putting in front of them a book of oracles, a set of oracles about which they were going to emote. Because if you ask them, what does the text say? And they say, well, I feel.
Yes.
I feel. I said, I'm not sure. What does it say? What does it say? You know? And give a report of that. So this pre-logical, the biggest problem that I found with respect to the students was that they couldn't find the definition on the page. And so they couldn't follow the argument. And so they were lacking this fundamental reading ability that you couldn't solve by means of a course in logic. You know? And if you wanted to teach them logic, you had to teach them first informally. So like the ancient Greeks learned it in the agora, listening to the conversations, and then engaging in the discussions, and then engaging in the formal principles. But if you try to introduce them to a course, an introductory course in logic, where they had to memorize the principles, you weren't developing the right habits. So you had each of these, it was hilarious, you had each of these groups at university analyzing the problems with critical thinking. You had the people who were in literature claiming that this was really their problem, because this was a grammatical problem, or a literary problem, poetic problem, a special inspiration coming from the gods or something that put them in touch with the text. And none of them knew what the heck they were doing because they were misdiagnosing the problem. Because in fact, I remember running into Father O'Connell, who became the president of Catholic University a number of years later. I felt sorry for him. I was at a faculty senate meeting. The first time they made the mistake of sending me to the faculty senate meeting from our campus in Staten Island. And he's an extremely nice person, but they were trying to change the curriculum at the university because they were getting complaints that the students didn't have reading abilities, literary abilities. Abbott talks about this in How to Read a Book in the 1940s. And so their idea was to get rid, change the curriculum. And I said to him, what you're saying reminds me of a farmer who's having trouble with the produce he's producing, and so he decides that he's basically a cattle farmer, and he decides that what he's going to do is go out and buy new equipment and improve the farm, the buildings, and so on. And he goes through all this, spends all this money, and then he finds out that his cattle have made cow disease. That nothing you do with respect to changing the curriculum is going to help the students because they don't like books. Not only do they not like books, and they read them. So how do you expect to be able to change the attitude unless you somehow have been able to stimulate the interest in enjoying reading, enjoying conversation, enjoying discussion? You're not going to get anywhere with this. And so the response that I had from the faculty was, well, we think that the curriculum is important. Just go right over the heads. It's not going to get anywhere with respect. Because the problem I found is really the abstraction problem of being able to take a look at the book, and how this involves the students found this painful. To focus attention on the text, which is like a total bodily movement. And they couldn't engage in the act of reading as a physical exercise. And I think let's get back to addressing that problem first, the abstraction problem. Finding the definitions, following the argument, and reading Plato is terrific for doing that. That's one of the reasons why I disagree with that, was who's the best person to use to introduce students to philosophy. I think you're far better off reading Plato than you are reading Aristotle.
Actually, in your paper, I thought of a guy I met in business some years ago, Dr. Stephen Cole, fascinating guy, with SPSS, this is the Practice for Social Science. He has a PhD in philosophy, with a dissertation in different science, and he has a master's in computer science. And he taught the statistics online, part-time, in a class at Western University. I mean, this guy can teach math and statistics for free, and they get excited and interested. So it's kind of different for a teacher. So I was talking to him one day, and we had a lot of trained statisticians who are also programmers in database management. This is back, probably in the early 90s, when we were just learning about large database sets. And he said, well, you know, I got these master level PhD statisticians, okay? But it's really hard to teach them how to think in marketing terms and how to ask the right questions to set up the model for analyzing the database. That's the algorithms and so forth are fine, and the math can be very impressive. But they're all based on the assumptions that go in. So the person designing the algorithms has to have that touch to look at the raw data, how he's going to set up. So there's that deep abstraction, you go to the abstract. He said, you know, I'm thinking about probably better rather than hiring PhD statisticians and master professors. I'm thinking of hiring liberal arts students and teaching them how to program, and teaching them statistics. And I don't know how that would turn out. He argued that he would probably have better results because they could engage in critical thinking, because it just wasn't working out. I see Eduardo nodding his head. Now, you get these ultra-trained statisticians, quantitative guys, but they have no sense of the data that they're working with, how to touch it. And the statistics, like we used to use a lot of structured community modeling, the critical questions you ask to set up the model, to write the algorithms, is actually the key to the whole thing. And only a guy like Cole would recognize that. This is a guy with a PhD in philosophy and also a degree. And I bet you Cole did that because he was very, very successful. So I'm not going to go out. I'm going to hire liberal arts students who know how to think, who know how to feel data, and train them to be statisticians. So
Have to do really the analysis. You know,
that's right, the analysis, yeah. So there's a lot of benefits to what a liberal arts background. At least the quantitative benefit. Somehow we haven't made that connection with education.
Mariana, you'll hear champions of critical thinking in the curriculum say something like, we teach students not what to think, but how to think. And I often suspect that critical thinking, that kind of program, is just a device to keep students from the dreaded keyword, truth, that somehow in the university you're going to learn something that's true. The word truth is a word you hardly ever hear. You can go 4 years at a college and never hear the word truth used. I remember the valedictorian at Harvard some years ago, in a commencement exercise, said the thing that she, keep in mind that the seal of Harvard University says Veritas. Right behind her, she said the thing that she was most proud about the faculty at Harvard was that during her 4 years, no professor ever was so brazen as to say something that was really true. Of course, they said relativism was true, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but don't you think that that's part of the strategy of critical thinking? It gives the illusion that you're somehow perfecting intellect while avoiding any content question. That's why you said they all disagree with each other, and they see that as the standard of knowledge.
Right, I think that's dealt with pretty directly in Dewey's instrumentalist philosophy. Because, I mean, he says that it doesn't matter whether or not what you're dealing with is true, that what matters is if it works. So in terms of critical thinking, it just seems to be it's a matter of how you process things to arrive at something that somehow can be empirically verified. But the problem is that, you're talking about, things that, what about things that can be empirically verified? People's personal experiences. I'm not sure.
And sometimes I'll defer to the empirical sciences that's talking about truth. That's where truth resides, and everything else is just sheer opinion in the university. But maybe they have a hard time justifying that too. I mean, some of the great philosophers of science like Thomas Kuhn and others today, these critical thinkers, they don't believe there's an objective knowledge in science and so forth.
Right, because even with Dewey, he talks about it's, completely individualized process. So the question is, how do you relate these individual experiences to the broader human knowledge? And I don't think he adequately is able to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Dewey was a man of his times, certainly, and that influences what he did. He was concerned about the laws of the period, the law temperament of the age, possibility and the frightening aspects of World War I. Secondly, we saw the growing movement for universal public education of all citizens, of all students between 6 and 16, and that was a completely new historical development which no nation had ever tried before, and you saw the reality of dealing with these millions of youngsters. Thirdly, he was concerned about the implications of democracy and citizenship. How do you educate people for democracy to allow, to encourage democracy to survive? So instrumentalism was his solution. Now, admittedly, it's too limited, it was too pragmatic. I think we can do better, but as they say, give the devil his due, he's the man of his hour. We saw the social, the educational, the political needs of the day, and tried very hard to address it. So I think he's a good example of a philosopher. He's called a philosopher of democracy for that reason. This is what American philosophy was. And I think he deserves that title. And admittedly, the instrumentalism is disappointing, it's fragmentary, we can do better than that. So there's a great in support for doing.
There's always a question of why it works, right? We want something that works, but why does it work? So we can't satisfy it. And what I said about truth, I think, should also be said about goodness, for instance. You can't talk about something being good. And that's more like a value judgment or moral.
Often it's about knowledge and that morals.
But I know a lot of working empirical scientists, they never discuss truth. They're not interested in it. They talk about verification. And one test after another, and finally solving the problem, but they wouldn't even want to engage in that conversation. It may be scientific books and so forth. And most of the working empirical science I know that, I mean, engage in a conversation like that. It's beyond them. It's not only vocabulary, the search for truth. It's the search for verification. It's in their discipline of science that they're concerned.
There are some scientists who are humble, and others who have never learned humility. I'm thinking of a passage I had my students read from Stephen Hawking, where he describes the necessity. There is a first cause, but how he describes it takes us way back to the pre-Socratics in Asia Minor, and he hasn't gone beyond that. There's something else that's needed, we've been to the pre-Socratics.
Yeah, I got a Bible study with a PhD engineer, okay, and he's actually one philosophy person. I dropped it after the first exam, I just understand what you're talking about. And we were Mr. Joseph Pete reading his book, and he said, I love this. So in all fairness to a lot of science, they never opened up to philosophy. That's for that.
Is Dewey focusing with that in terms of truth? Is he interpreting a social consciousness?
Yes, because he was dismayed at the failure of philosophers for 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years, to reach any kind of consensus that we could make pedagogically, that had pedagogical applications. That was his goal, pedagogical applications, not philosophical. He's not a philosopher in that sense. This has to have pedagogical communications with a child, a 6 to 16-year-old in American public schools. That's the genius, that's the framework.
Right.
So yes, it has to be social conscious.
You thought Rousseau was the great genius of education. So he's a Rousseau.
Yes.
But he was also critical, so at the same time.
He's what,
Basically, he thought that Rousseau focused too much on the individual. Dewey focused, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, more, he sees the individual within the context of society, and he thinks that Rousseau, I think, I've seen some arguments that he misinterpreted Rousseau, but basically that Rousseau's mission is to develop the natural abilities of a child. And Dewey thinks that the child is neither a moral or an immoral being. You have to give them free rein to develop. So basically, he thinks that Rousseau, in thinking that developing that nature as developing nature as an aim of education is too limited. He thinks that you have to create more of a social context.
Yeah, whether Rousseau's not structured enough, Rousseau's got those three stages of development, animal nature, and civic, and moral and civic. And I think Dewey would want to have more control. You don't have any real fight against his environment, basically, to come to education. One of the phrases that I often hear contemporary pedagogues use in terms of education and what they're doing is that they're getting students to question their belief systems. And I remember running into a fellow at the National Association of Scholars maybe 8 years ago. Normally, we kind of set the place up, and I remember where it's in. And he was unconsolable because he had got to the point where he said that he could no longer teach because the students didn't believe that. He couldn't get to the question of they don't believe in anything. The net effect of the lack of communication between substances. If a teaching revolution goes into
Rousseau's famous metaphor of chains, Dewey would have objected to that because the institutions have, as he said, Rousseau says, corrupted in effect. And Dewey was convinced that democracy was the way that all society should live, and that we identify, we grow. He gave priority in Experience in Nature, the book Experience in Nature, to the relationship between the individual and the whole, or the citizen and democracy, and that we develop ourselves by interacting within the community, within democracy. So the institution is good, it is one of our formative influences. So he would have certainly objected to that notion that institutions are corrupted in some way or oppressive. It's the source of our development.
Here's the problem I had raising kids, all of our kids, our grandkids especially. My wife was an English teacher. We read with them all. Linda would sit at the bedside night. And so all of them read. And we were told, we sat. We had readers at the back, okay? And my English teacher wife said, oh, life is worthwhile, okay? As soon as they became adolescents, at the age of 13 to 14, it stopped, okay? And now, with the two youngest ones, we go completely because they've got this in their hand all the time, okay? So it's boring. But at least the earlier set of grades, we had at least, and studies have shown that the early stage of adolescence, the reading kicks off. Even for kids who have been reading at home and growing, and we saw, well, the child development really early with reading habits. And we have them reading sports heroes or anything to get them reading novels and so forth. And they got very nice novels, but then it stopped. Studies done at Harvard, they're MIT. Some of the brains of our kids, you get them to read a 200-page book is almost impossible. They'll tell you that. So my grandson, Tommy, who excels at calculus and math, he prides himself that I've never had to read a book for an English class, I've always read the Cliff Notes. And that's a sign of pride with it, with almost a seer to it, as a mathematician by a student, reading through. But that's the thing that has puzzled me. It's, I mean, despite the early childhood habits, it still stops in early adolescence. And I don't know how to solve that one. I don't.
Well, I don't think it stopped with that. I don't think it stopped with that, or might be a characteristic of some students. I don't know whether Chris, did it stop with you?
Sorry?
Did it stop with you, the interest in reading?
No.
Got that?
Not at all.
You're also interested in mathematical physics and that kind of.
Okay.
So,
I'm talking about social phenomenon of kids today. It really is frustrating. How the heck do you gain any kind of thinking if you don't read?
well, but they are reading. They're reading in a kind of interactive kind of fashion.
Texting, they read
Texting.
text.
In a kind of conversational relationship with the machine.
But Chris would know where in the order of being mathematics is, right? Mathematics and physics, right? You know where, and I think that's what the problem is today, is that when you ask that question about logic, what is considered critical thinking? It's mathematical thinking. And what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, I'd like to ask the European professors here, what kind of logic courses are being taught in universities? Isn't it symbolic logic? And then the logic of Aristotle is called today, I think I'm quoting about McNerney, ordinary language logic. It's not rigorous enough, only because the metaphysics is not understood. Right? Metaphysics is properly understood. So then as a result, they go to what is being done here. They go to a lower order of being, quantified being, right? And so now what is understood by what critical thinking is a mathematical type thinking.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's not, you don't have to make a causal connection. Right. You could do with the syllogism kind of.
I say it's even worse than that, because the mathematics of our days is really not philosophical mathematics like it used to be in ancient times. That would really be a science. These mathematics are closer, I'd say, to the trivium than they are to the trivium.
Yeah, I was just going to push on that notion that you brought up there, metaphysics, and how it's the most certain and most self-evident principles for these things. And with the rejection of metaphysics, you ultimately lose all certainty and frustration with regard to the student specifically engaging in whatever science he happens to be working on. But, I think to an extent that's true when we talk about self-evident principles. The whole is greater than part, that all excluded middle, well, contradiction, things like that. But some of the more difficult bits of metaphysics are dealt with after the physics, things like that, where you have to move from something that's more known to something less known. So you're going from something that's more certain to something that's less certain. So I was just going to push on that, just that point that you had made there, that if you're in every case going from something that's more certain to something that's less certain, but we get to some very difficult bits in the metaphysics, how do you make sense of that?
Well, in my paper, I talk about the first principles are pre-metaphysical. So in a sense, the previous sciences, like the physics, it's through our experiences with that we eventually realize that there are certain principles that are universal, and we end up creating a metaphysics in which studies those principles as being the most abstractly. And realizing through the development of the metaphysics that all the other sciences borrow from that science ultimately. So it's kind of an interaction. Does that kind of answer your question?
Maybe I may say something, because I think this was an obstacle that I found years ago, and I thought it was very interesting. I think we need to make a distinction between something being more certain to us and being more certain in itself, or more novel to us. So we certainly start with what is more novel to us, which is, the senses, but at some point, and through analogy, we come to know these things that are more certain in themselves, and we can reach that certainty of metaphysics, which is much higher than mathematics or physics. So there are two orders, really. There's what is first according to the way of knowing, and what is first, according to the nature of the thing.
Right, yeah, it's indemonstrable first principles that the sciences presuppose include awarenesses that we get through this faculty of particular reason, cognitive reason, or the estimative sense, like the fact that we're capable of knowing in the first place, that you and knower is a first principle, which is evident for St. Thomas and Aristotle. That first principles are not premises, logical premises. And one of the problems I found with somebody like Dewey is that it's very difficult to pin these people down about what a principle is, and where you start your reasoning from when the principles seem to be process. Well, where's the formal object? Now, it's interesting that you have this divide among many 20th century Thomaists who look at philosophy as a kind of view of an organization, and people like Dewey who stress philosophy as being a habit. Right? But the habit that doesn't have any organization, or the organization that doesn't have any habit. And what you need to do is you need to combine both of them so that you have a formal object for a science, so the knower and the thing known belong to the same genus. Yeah. Because you're never talking about the subject whose causes of unity that you're trying to articulate, you're never going to get these two people to belong to the same genus. They talk to one another. It's like they talk to Barnum.
I want to give a point for Eduardo. He took me through an experience this year for 2 hours. He set up a webinar session for me, and he introduced something to me he's been working on how many years?
I don't know.
It's called mathematical metaphysics. Mathematical metaphysics. I was intrigued because when I meet empirical guys, they say, well, we're mathematical. We're not philosophers up there in the. And so Eduardo said, I want you to look at this, because I'm working on this for a number of years. So and he told us to have mathematics now. Because it's simple enough, And so he said, well, the mathematics I'm going to is the mathematics that Aristotle and those guys used. The arithmetic, the original arithmetic is what our metaphysics is based on. And he took me through a 2-hour presentation on geometry, which all of our metaphysical principles are based on. It was the most fascinating 2 hours I've ever had, and I highly recommend anybody do. So I'm going to have to post on you if they want a webinar, you set it up sometime. You have to sit through the 2-hour presentation. You don't have to be a mathematician. Okay? If you add 2 and 2, and you know what lines are, and figures and triangles, you will get it. And I have never seen metaphysics made so clear. And go back to what you do, Kevin, in terms of images and so forth.
Right.
You talk virtual quality, I can think of 3 or 4 images now that begin to explain. It's an invaluable experience, mathematical metaphysics. It's well done. I plug it.
Thank you. I'll give you your commission.
Yes, we're very lucky to have an incredible group of people that have assembled in this organization. Exceptional skills in a wide variety of areas, which makes us pretty much the only game in town as far as trying to be able to solve a lot of these problems that are confronting.
Here, can I make a-
No pressure, right, Peter? No pressure on us to solve the world.
No, gotta start somewhere.
This is a good point to make a plug for in-route books, okay?
Oh, God, certainly.
Sebastian, of course. Something doesn't still there. Trying to couple them tonight. But Sebastian is founder of in-route Publication. He's also been very involved with this group. And he called me about 3 months ago and he said, I bought another company, it's called 10 D's Books. And I said, what's this about? He said, it's what you told us to do. We've got to get a distribution channel. And she's written books and been very successful. I call it Prepare Your Kids for First Communion and so forth. I said, now you're talking. I said, how many on this? 8,000 Catholic bookstores and evangelical language. Okay? I said, so we talked about the kind of books that we want. That people would come into a Catholic bookstore and buy off the shelf and read no more than 150 pages. It's one reason I really encourage Ted to come here and we can talk to him here. He's been publishing very successful at writing styles of books that lay people read, people in the pews will read. So I want to extend an invitation to people here. I'm looking for authors who will work with us, who have a booking. It's not going to be an academic book or a scholarly book. But we want to get it down to 150 pages. You put that illustrations in it. And Father Polly at breakfast the other morning said, also we use his website. If you want to really work the book out, you want to do a paper first, we'll probably test it there first to see how it flies over the internet. Okay? So I'm now the new marketing and sales director of Amaral Books. So I'd like you to work with us.
What's the focus?
Well, here's the first series you want to bring down. The first series I'm talking about is how to raise an intelligent, creative, and moral Catholic child. Families that will read. One that Kevin and I talked about the other day is how to raise a prudent child. Things like that. That would be written in a language, and we'll learn more as we go along. If you want to do something on how to teach your kid critical thinking up to adolescence or something like that, and you're a journalist, think of something to be creative. We can talk here. And it's great to talk, in our Thomistic camp every summer, but we've got to get it done. That's what Ragamuffin Thomism is all about. It has to get to the people asking me this week, well, why did Peter pick the word Ragamuffin? It's got to get to the street.
I like the idea of a book to promote critical thinking in the right way. To sort of summarize the result of our sessions, what I heard from a number of people is that critical thinking divorced from all these other important approaches. Solid grounding in sense realism, it engages the imagination. If you bring that together from the traditions, then you have the critical thinking that's not on offer in the university. So there's the book.
But keep it at least readable.
The biggest problem I found with respect to this critical thinking issue was that the administrators could not admit the fact that they didn't know precisely what the problem was. And they kept blaming the students. That the students are lacking in motivation.
Right.
I would say to the faculty, it's the fact that the faculty members always teach. Now, we see put in the races of the faculty members, and the administrators couldn't admit that they couldn't identify the problem because they didn't know how to read either. They didn't know how to take a text apart from the standpoint of looking for the order and the organization, so that you could get students in the habit of reading from the standpoint of following the argument. What's the argument? When does the argument change? Well, you got to change the definition. When the definition changes, the argument changes. And how do you locate that on the page? Where do you go when one argument begins, another argument? And the people in literature say, well, you got to find the topic sentence. What the students don't tend to understand what that is, or you teach them the grammar. So what? What good is that going to do? I had inmates at Rikers Island in at Arthur Hill Correctional Facility who couldn't read, but they could follow an argument. It was what kind of a brand it was? But they went to the bar
their approach was, Julia would say, critical thinking is my thinking. Which is what those professors are saying.
There's a school of logic that published about it in French, so I mentioned it because some of us may not be aware. Laval University,
Yes.
where there's an inclination to unite what we might call material and formal logic. Yes. So Monsignor and so for a book like the one you're suggesting, I think that would be a useful source.
Absolutely.
You could write one too.
Yeah. You got the Canadian connection. Wow.
I like that.
Perfect.
You're comic.
Well, we're openly doing.
Well, go with that book.
There's also this topical portion of that too, being able to read across, the different eras, and bringing in the point of having something seen as a great conversation where you're able to relate the things that were said later to the ones that were said before. And that's a skill I think that's been largely lost.
Right.
But I think it's very much in this critical thing.
Yeah, it starts with being able to follow the arguments, locate the arguments on a page, and then you can bring in the analogy. We can go back to the beginnings of the arguments. I've always read Aquinas that fashion, and I found that I was able to understand what he was saying better by reading Plato than anybody else, because the first beginnings of the arguments, the principles, were there, and then you can see how Aristotle moved them in a different direction. And for example, his propter quid and quia demonstrations actually come out of Plato. In his posterior analytics, he talks about the demonstratio propter quid related, and Thomas gives this example, the Menon. Menon's, in the argument, the discussion between Socrates and Menon served as the prime example of the demonstratio propter quid. And then the quia, he refers to, St. Thomas indirectly, because he obviously couldn't have read Plato's Republic, book one, but the discussion that Socrates is having with Cephalus. And he says that moral reasoning proceeds from a demonstratio quia, right? Not the propter quid, and therefore you have to have per alia notum principle based upon experience for the starting point of the reasoning, rather than the per se notum principle that you get from the kind of syllogistic reasoning and deductive reasoning in the propter quid demonstration.
I meant to ask you, Adler seems to have looked at philosophy as very dialectical.
Yes.
And so I've always been puzzled with why did he emphasize Aristotle so much in the book of Plato?
Well, he has a heavy influence of Plato on, like, the God of the Professors article, that's almost totally taken out of the Gorgias. But he doesn't mention him. It's almost like he's absorbed it, and he doesn't realize the impact that it had on him. I think that that this is one of the problems I have with his notion of science and philosophy. I think Maritain corrupted it with respect to the understanding of science. So he thinks that philosophy, he doesn't think of philosophy as a system or a logical system, and he thinks of it almost as a habit, but more or less like a conversational habit, right? Where you have to have this group conversation out of which the principles develop. So it's not like he's got the individual faculty, and it doesn't achieve science in the sense of this using I forget Maritain, idioscopic is the difference between the idioscopic and the sinoscopic procedures. I think he's working off of that to a certain extent with respect to science. I don't think that's accurate. But, so you wind up with, he more or less reduced his philosophy to a kind of collective opinion that's
Yeah, I got that impression.
being arrived at.
And that's not Aristotle.
No, it's Hegel to a certain extent, from his Summa Dialectica. Hegel had a heavy influence on our, on that, then they were, but he came closer to, recognizing a lot of these truths than most other thinkers did in this time. So, anyway, I think that might be good if you are all satisfied with this conversation and with the
Your presentation. Thinking.
Yeah.
Great thinking critically, very.
Thank you very much.
Sure. We're gonna break for lunch and we'll be back at 2 p.m.
Practice.
We're not gonna bracket for lunch, we're gonna break for lunch.
Get into that concept, put it into practice.